Valve's catalog is seriously impressive. I genuinely don't think there's a company that even comes close to Valve's consistent output, especially not in the FPS genre. These guys are responsible for hit after hit after hit, and you'd have to look pretty hard to find an objectively low quality Valve product. But while people debate amongst themselves whether the worst thing Valve ever made is Ricochet, Day of Defeat, or Alien Swarm, I'm of the opinion that one of the objectively worst Valve products has been sitting right under our nose the entire time. And the chances are if you're watching this video, it's probably in your Steam library. I want you to imagine it's 2003. Oh, also imagine you're a big nerd. Yeah, there we go. You were a big fan of the first Half-Life, released all the way back in '98, and had already played through Opposing Force and Blue Shift when those games came out. Considering 2 out of the 3 Half-Lives released at this point had multiplayer deathmatch modes, you'd probably be expecting that the just announced Half-Life 2 would also include a multiplayer deathmatch mode. And lo and behold, upon release, it doesn't. Weirdly enough, especially looking back, Half-Life 2 didn't launch with a multiplayer deathmatch mode like Half-Life and Opposing Force did. For a small time frame near Half-Life 2's release, the closest thing it even had to multiplayer was Counter-Strike Source, which understandably left some folks upset. But 2 weeks later, while teasing the release of the highly anticipated SDK for Half-Life 2, Valve began to also tease a special surprise that would be included along with it. Now, most people who weren't complete dum-dums started putting the puzzle pieces together, and they realized that this was Valve's way of telling fans to expect Half-Life 2's deathmatch component to drop at any second. And on November 30th, 2004, in the form of a 32MB update, it did. Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was actually pretty well received when it came out. People enjoyed finally being able to use Half-Life 2's groundbreaking physics in a multiplayer setting, and for people who wanted a more relaxed experience than Counter-Strike Source, HL2DM provided a fun, casual alternative to the Valve games that were out at the time. It also appeased fans who were still stuck in the mindset of the Gold Source era of Half-Life, and satiated their appetites for those who had come to expect a deathmatch game mode with every new Half-Life release. 2 years after its release in 2006, Half-Life 2 Deathmatch had a pretty lively competitive scene, was regularly seen in Steam's top 10 most played games, and as hard as it might be to believe, was pulling in over 20,000 players a day. There's even some Steam groups from back in the day that boast some pretty impressive numbers. This Steam group has more people in it than have played Half-Life 2 Deathmatch in like 10 years. What? And as weird as this popularity might seem now, it really wasn't an accident. While Half-Life 2 Deathmatch might seem pretty bare bones and obsolete now, when it was released it was one of the very few tastes of Source Engine multiplayer that the public had. For better or for worse, Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was the original proving ground for classic Source culture like strafing and bunny hopping. It was also the public's very first taste of custom Source maps, which are a pretty damn big deal no matter what corner of Source you operate in. So, hearing about Half-Life 2 Deathmatch's popularity and how important it was for just about every multiplayer Source game, I think most people would look at it in its current state and ask the same question that I did. Just what the hell happened? Did a catastrophic update introduce so many bugs that people lost interest in it? Or maybe it was a lack of new content that slowly bled the community dry, resulting in abysmal player numbers? Honestly, no. I mean, not really. I guess both of those things could be technically true, but to be honest with you, HL2DM as you and I know it, the janky, hastily slapped together mess that it is, was pretty much always like this. It's not so much that HL2DM changed, it's that every single thing around it did. Despite what people will probably tell you, HL2DM isn't really a story of post-launch developer neglect like Half-Life Source is. The game actually got a lot more attention than most people probably realize. Some might even say it got more attention than it even deserved. The original launch of Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was shockingly lightweight. The first release of the game came with only 2 maps and a very limited arsenal. No crowbar, no sunstick, and no slams. No crowbar in a Half-Life game. Despite these shortcomings, it seemed most people were pretty blinded by the euphoria of getting to play with a gravity gun in a multiplayer setting. I know I would be. In fact, most of the criticism towards the game at the time was directed towards the lack of the super gravity gun, or not being able to pick players up with a gravity gun. What? Do you live in Candyland? Basically, people just wanted more gravity gun, and they didn't really care if anything else fell short. Obviously, epic physics can't hold a game forever though, especially with more fully fledged Source multiplayer experiences right around the corner. So, in an attempt to stop the game's community from starving to death before it had even eaten, Valve slowly began pushing small updates for HL2DM. After adding a few of their own original maps, some based on old Half-Life 1 classics, Valve actually for the first time in Source history began officially accepting community-made levels through map competitions. That gave us maps like DM Resistance and Underpass, and it set the blueprint for the model later picked up by TF2, which is probably responsible for HL2DM being irrelevant these days. Ask yourself something. If you're a Source guy in 2007, why would you play Half-Life 2 Deathmatch once TF2 comes out? Come on. The final nail in the coffin that made Half-Life 2 Deathmatch irrelevant was the Orange Box update. It changed the way the game felt, get rid of some really important movement mechanics like bunny hopping, and shed the majority of its diehard fans, leaving it in a nasty, unpopular state. Which is the state that it's still in to this day. Now with what I've said here, you might be starting to think that I hate Half-Life 2 Deathmatch or something, but that's not really the case. In fact, there are a few good things about Half-Life 2 Deathmatch that I admire, and I'm fascinated by those things. One of those things is the... Hold on.
One of those things is the game's map selection. Now, earlier we established that HL2DM launched with a disappointing catalog of only 2 maps, being Overwatch and Lockdown. And unlike many of the maps from Half-Life 1 Deathmatch, which were created from scratch by seasoned level designers, these 2 were basically just reworked areas from the single-player campaign, hastily thrown together in what couldn't have been more than an afternoon's worth of work. Now, to give some credit to the developers, the official maps we got in later updates are far more detailed and interesting, although they're still far from Valve's best work. For example, DM Runoff, which is kind of HL2DM's answer to the iconic Crossfire map from HL1, isn't properly sealed, meaning that if you can manage to clip out of the map, you can shoot at people from out of bounds with effective invulnerability from anything other than explosives. A lot of the other maps have clearly had corners cut as well. You'll find plenty of primitive-looking environments and leftover areas from earlier in the map's development lazily blocked off. But see, the thing about HL2DM's maps that's always racked my brain since I was a kid is the bizarre way they dance around the lore of the single-player campaign. One of the main differences between Half-Life 1's Deathmatch mode and HL2DM is in its style and presentation. For some reason, while the original Half-Life Deathmatch mode was unabashedly absurd, allowing players to assume the model of G-Man or a zombie shooting bees at each other, HL2DM is comparatively super grounded, limiting you to only Rebels and Combine. In fact, players' arsenals even differ depending on what model they pick to further this sense of immersion. The Rebels get crowbars and SMGs, while the Combine gets stun sticks and AR-2s. Because of this, it definitely seems like players were at least in part intended to view HL2DM's combat encounters as in-universe skirmishes between the Resistance and Combine forces, not dissimilar to the ones we see during the City 17 uprising in Half-Life 2. And I know it's really stupid, but that fact has always made me want to analyze the HL2DM maps from a canon-adjacent lens, Combine over Wiki notice be damned. Almost all of the original maps in the game clearly riff on established locations from Half-Life 2. Runoff is some part of the canals we never saw, Steam Lab seems to be some mysterious Resistance lab similar to Black Mesa East, and the community map Resistance even visibly takes place along the Ravenholm rail yard. But despite all this, there's also a weird amount of things that undermine this groundedness, and unfortunately make my childlike delusion of HL2DM's canon status indefensible. For example, the presence of teleporters in some of these maps just doesn't make sense. The entire story of HL2 is a struggle between aliens and the humans they only keep around in the hopes they'll eventually help them develop stable local teleportation. So if stable local teleporters are such an impossibly difficult technology to master, why does HL2DM allow me to stumble into random warehouses and find like 5 of them laying around in perfect condition to throw toilets through or whatever? There's other oddities with the maps too, like this citizen ration dispenser in Lockdown that for some reason gives the player health and armor, and the unkillable headcrabs being kept in cages on Steam Labs. And finally, there's the elephant in the room of every single player having a gravity gun and rocking HEV suit hands in the view model, which obviously makes no sense. So, if the game is clearly not canon, why did they put in any effort to ground it at all? Well, I have no idea. Maybe there were at one point aspirations to further ground the game into its setting that were cancelled or never made it off the ground, or maybe the game was just so low priority that no one at Valve ever thought about it that hard.
Excuse me. Now with all of that said, and with a clearer image of how Half-Life 2 Deathmatch originally launched, you probably want to know how Half-Life 2 Deathmatch is today. Well, the long and short of that story is, it still sucks. I really don't know if I can emphasize enough how horrible this game feels to play. You might think I'm being too harsh on it or not appreciating the source jank of it all, but the truth is it's borderline unplayable sometimes. Even on servers where I had 60, 70 ping, using the gravity gun felt like complete garbage. I was on LAN servers where I was hosting on my own network, and it still felt like garbage. There are tons of little oddities that contribute to this though. View model sway for whatever reason is turned down to the point where it might as well not even be there, and there are a handful of weapons that straight up don't even react to the player walking at all, so you're just sliding across the ground and it's nasty. A lot has changed community-wise since Half-Life 2 Deathmatch's original release in 2004, and the community being shrunken down to such a small scale has brought out what I consider to be the worst that the game has to offer. The majority of servers being hosted right now are ping spoofing, drastically alter how the game plays, or straight up aren't even Deathmatch at all. It's kind of a bit sad, honestly. I challenge you to boot up Half-Life 2 Deathmatch and see how long it takes you to find an unmodified vanilla server. The worst part is the most populated servers are by and large the role-playing ones, so in the cosmically impossible event that somebody is new to Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, their first experience with the game will be weird, janky RP servers that don't actually represent what the game really is. Not that I'm completely opposed to overhauling HL2DM though. The community used to play weird game modes like Death Run on Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, which is a nice little early example of the Source engine being used as a Gmod-like tool. Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was also home of the original Light RP, which later transformed into the global phenomenon we now know as Dark RP. I can't deny the early cultural impact that these custom servers had. This stuff is fine, you know, it's harmless fun. But turning Half-Life 2 Deathmatch into nasty Quake with high gravity and like quad damage, what is this, man? Come on, man. Come on, dog. Also, this is like really weird, but the Steam store page for Half-Life 2 Deathmatch only has screenshots of weird custom maps. There's not a single image among these that is an actual official map, which is weird. It's important to remember throughout all this that Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was more or less created by one man. When I emailed the project lead for Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, he told me that the team behind Half-Life 2 DM was effectively non-existent. He was just sneaking work in between trying to ship Half-Life 2. Here's an interesting clip of Gabe Newell discussing Half-Life 2 before its release. He's just got done demonstrating Half-Life 2, and what he says after that is pretty interesting.
In addition to showing Half-Life 2, we've also been talking about our multiplayer for the first time.
Now, I'm no expert on Valve's development, but judging from this clip and Counter-Strike Source being labeled multiplayer demo, I think it's pretty safe to assume that the majority of Valve considered CSS to be Half-Life 2's official multiplayer mode. From what I can tell, Gabe Newell had no idea that a lone dev was making a more traditional deathmatch mode for Half-Life 2, which explains its state pretty well. There's not a lot to suggest that Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was in development before Half-Life 2 was effectively done. I'm not here trying to claim that Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was made in 2 weeks, but it certainly looks that way. What Half-Life 2 Deathmatch is not is good. What it is, though, is a Half-Life fan who is just as confused as everybody else as to why Half-Life 2 didn't come with a deathmatch mode. The only difference was that this Half-Life fan worked at Valve and figured he could do something about it. Half-Life 2 Deathmatch might undeniably just be Valve's worst product, which is pretty painful to admit because I kinda like it. So I guess if you're a super literal guy who came to this video looking for a solid answer to what happened to Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, the answer is, nothing. Nothing quality-wise really changed between Half-Life 2 DM's launch and now. It was a project created in a very, very short time by a man who was a fan of Half-Life 2 and also happened to work on Half-Life 2. There's people around the internet who will claim that the 2013 Steam Pipe update is the reason that Half-Life 2 Deathmatch feels so bad, and while there may be some merit to that claim, I don't think it's to blame for Half-Life 2 Deathmatch not being popular nowadays. From what I can tell, it was always a pet project by a couple of guys that somehow ended up becoming a retail product for one of the largest game companies in the world, I think. So I guess instead of asking what happened to Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, you should instead be expressing shock at how it even managed to get as far as it did. It's hard to fault HL2DM for dying so quickly when its competition was one of the greatest multiplayer games of all time. But maybe there's some cool takeaway from HL2DM's story. Despite having all the odds stacked against it, and launching without the damn crowbar, it still managed to be a very important puzzle piece for this wacky thing that we call the Source community. Wow, that's so touching. Thanks for watching, and remember to play Half-Life 2 Deathmatch. Remember to load that game up right now in your Steam library and download 400 megabytes of annoying Quake sounds so that you can lag your way through a Brazilian server. It's so much fun. I've been Lobber. Thanks to Richter for Poopy Goopy Sloopy, and goodbye. Peace.
Chad Warren ain't no fanboy. Chad Warren just likes a system that's the best, alright? That's that triple.